Let's get more perspective on Russia's suspension from the United Nations Human Rights Council, as Livingston Weche joins me from Abuja via Zoom. Good to have you join us.
Thank you, and good to be with you too.
What do you make of this latest development, and how important is it?
Well, it's quite an interesting development, particularly in view of the fact that Ukraine-Russia war, as it were, has become the global focus and the greatest concern as it concerns humanitarian crisis. Well, if you look at the complexities of international law with respect to the suspension of Russia from the UN Human Rights Council, you would come to terms with the selectiveness of the international law concept, because in the records of the UN Human Rights Council, only 2 countries have been suspended in history from that council. The first suspension was in 2011 when Libya was suspended, and incidentally that had to do with some of the crises touching on America and NATO invasion that resulted in the killing of Muammar Gaddafi. But I think if this will bring some form of restraint to help arrest the rising cases of avoidable deaths of innocent civilians, it may be necessary to take this step if that will help arrest the killings. Because what is most important in without prejudice is that the killing of the wanton killing through the military activities of Russia in Ukraine should be stopped, so diplomatic channels can be properly explored. Even though one begins to wonder that whilst we are also saying that this should be for the purposes of protecting humanitarian personalities in Ukraine, one begins to ask why these types of actions were not taken by against similar invasions by countries such as the United States in some very smaller countries in times past, because they have been very human rights violation, and this type of suspension did not take place. Yes, abstain votes, there were 24 against, and then there were about 58 abstentions. So part of that 58 abstentions, 21 was from Africa, including Nigeria.
I want to get to that shortly, Mr. Weche. I want to get to that shortly because it really did get a lot of attention, because we have some African countries abstaining and some voting against that resolution. But before we get there, there is also now a call for Russia to be suspended from the Security Council. That call was made by President Zelensky because he believes that Russia is using the instrument of that council to protect itself from any possible action against it. Do you think that Russia can be suspended from the Security Council?
Is on the road, has its own veto powers, and then you cannot arbitrarily suspend a country like Russia. Remember what happened when the votes on the Russian invasion came up at the UN Security Council, condemning that action. The veto of Russia alone turns the table, and that particular action failed. But we also see nations trying to use instrumentality, measuring up with the international powers to push against Russia. And then we see China taking with Russia in trouble. I think is that at this point, diplomatic efforts should remain sustained, because we see the drama is, ironically, even the America that is also leading this suspension of Russia from the UN Human Rights Council is still depending on Russian gas and Russian oil. Europe is still depending on Russian gas. America is still importing a very large quantum of crude from Russia up to today, despite the sanctions that have
America has said that it is halting. I'm sorry, just to jump in, because America has said that it is halting any sort of importation of oil from Russia. At the last count, if I remember clearly, the President Biden did ask that the some liters of oil be released. I think it was about millions of liters of oil be released from the nation's reserve. So I think in that regard, the United States seems to be moving faster than Europe in that regard, because Europe is still quite dependent on Russia. But I want to ask you about, because you keep talking about the diplomatic path should be found. There should be a way to get out of this quagmire. But do you think it's possible to get Russia to the table now, especially with the suspension from the Human Rights Council?
You see, you don't rule out the carrot and the stick approach. I think, like I did say, and I also hope that this suspension is aimed at restraining Russia from causing further colossal loss of lives in Ukraine. But if that is not the aim, and if it is solely aimed at just punishing Russia and then pushing them to the wall to keep sustaining their hostility in Ukraine, then that approach may not work, because we have seen the failure of mere sanctions. Sanctions have not deterred Russia from the current engagement in Ukraine. But again, I would urge Russia to also review its approach. I saw a report that some of the regions in Ukraine are already experiencing a measure of ceasefire. That the reason is so as Russia can have the opportunity to consolidate on what it refers to as its gains so far in the Ukrainian war. You see, this battle has a lot of intricacies, intrigues, and contradictions in them, because they go back to a lot of interests that have to do with Russian security. And you see, there have been several security advices in the past that Russia should be watched, and no attempt by Ukraine should be made to lure Ukraine by NATO to lure Ukraine into NATO, because that would lead to a measure of provocation. It's unfortunate that the world, some of these superpowers, instigated this war by luring Ukraine, in quotes, into this war, even though Ukraine is a sovereign state, and I support their stance in ensuring that their sovereignty is protected. This war is condemnable. It's not justifiable in any way, but we must also be looking beyond the other remote and immediate factors that resulted in this war. So we know also what Russia is asking for. What is Russia demanding? Russia is saying our security is under threat. Ukraine should not join NATO, because joining NATO will mean undermining the security and the safety of Russia before its enemies. So at this point, what should be done now that conversations and diplomatic talks have continued to hold between Russian and Ukrainian officials? The other superpowers should push that angle to get the president of Russia to talk to the world. Because there is no situation that diplomacy cannot resolve. The international community, the principal actors in this issue, should also find a way to talk to China, because it does appear that Russia has China's ears. They listen to what China says.
And so does Ukraine, because Ukraine is a very important trade partner to China. So you're right. Exactly. China is about the only country that can do something in terms of diplomatic relations and just keeping that dialogue ongoing. We'll see how it plays out. I wish we have enough time to talk about the fact that Nigeria abstained, and countries like South Africa, South Sudan, and Niger also abstained, as well as Ethiopia, Zimbabwe, and Eritrea voting against, which was quite shocking. But I'm told my time is up. I'm sure in subsequent conversations this will come up. Thank you so much for talking to us, Livingston Wechi. Thank you for talking to us.